I'm Carrie Burns, and this is a continuation of my course on the Monas Hieroglyphica or Hieroglyphic Monad of Dr. John Dee, using the translation that Dr. Nancy Turner and I made that came out a couple years ago. By the way, if you're interested in a physical copy of this work, I've got a link to where you can get our translation below. But for now, we are up to almost to the end of Theorem 21, and so that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, those of you who have been studying along with me all this time know my next spiel here, that I assume that you understand this is an advanced class. Okay, you know who John Dee is, you know what the hieroglyphic monad is, but beyond that, you have read and understood Dee's letter to Maximilian, his letter to the printer, his first 20 theorems, and you have read and tried to understand Theorem 21, which is the one that we are finishing up now. You've also caught his allusions with my help to various other texts like the Sefer Yetzirah, like the Bible, like different works of Plato, and so on. So if you're just jumping in now, probably this isn't going to make a whole lot of sense unless you've already done a lot of other types of Hermetic study, and even then. But there's 4 different playlists below. I would absolutely love to have you join this course, not just because it will give the rest of us another person with whom we can talk about the hieroglyphic monad, but because these ideas are really valuable for their own sake in terms of how they help one make sense of the world and the condition the world is in. Now, I have assumed up to this point, or through 20 really, that an educated humanist in Dee's era who was interested in what you see down here, mathematics, magic, Cabala, and anagogy, could catch those illusions and follow along, although it would take effort, but the effort would be worthwhile. But as we move through these final theorems, like I said in the very last video, things have shifted a little bit. It's harder and harder to find particular references, and that's largely because Dee has a kind of secret text we know now, the Codex Marcianus graecus 299. We started to see glimmers of that back in 15, where when Dee gives in Greek that famous quote, nature rejoices in nature, an educated humanist in his time might say, oh, that's a reference to Democritus, because he's talked about Democritus in the letter and theorem. Or they might say, no, it's a reference to the Turbo Philosophorum, because then we get Ostanes also, and he's referred to Ostanes. But if we look at the most elaborate articulation of those ideas, the Isis the Prophetess to her son Horus letter, that only exists in the Codex Marcianus graecus 299. I've got a whole video on that below. It's a fascinating text, really. I believe it's one of the most fascinating texts I've read in my life. It's Isis is first merging with this archangel, then you figure out she's in the underworld, in effect the afterlife, at a real important moment when her husband Osiris, who has been killed by their brother Set, is being remembered literally and reborn as her son Horus. So that's in the Codex Marcianus graecus, and it is not well known in Dee's time. I can't find any other reference to it but here. But not only that, people didn't even know until the second half of the last century that Dee had a copy of that. So if that is kind of his secret text, or one of them, I mean, then you really kind of need a teacher. Well, I'm sorry, I'm kind of all you got right now. But this is why people like C.H. Jostin said that there was probably an oral teaching that went along to it, or one of the many reasons. I'm going to come back to that about halfway through this presentation. But let's jump back into where we were before. This was in the translation I did with Nancy on page 85. This is a paragraph that begins, let us now examine the nature of the third part, using the same fundamentals of our hieroglyphic art. First, it seemed to wear on its head a double moon. We've talked about what all of these parts labeled B, D, and C are. The monad is flipped now because we are understanding the perfect structure of the afterlife. That may be why there's no A here, right? That was the first world. That was perfect, golden age, all of those things, that world of being, the tree when it was created, but before it had fallen. So this top of it, this double moon, is Aries. You close that, and you get this circle thing over here that is E. Next, it's annex the hieroglyphic sign for the elements. The duplicated moon can here be explained according to the material supplied, that is, everything up to this point in the hieroglyphic monad, thusly as the twofold grades of the moon. We're speaking about those grades of which expert natural philosophers can find only four among all of created nature, namely being, living, feeling, and comprehending. So those are the grades we're going to try to figure out what are being, feeling, living, and comprehending, and the twofold grades of the moon. Therefore, the first of these two grades is designated as belonging to this. This, as I've said before, is a unclear referent. It can refer to the twofold grades of the moon. It can refer to being, living, feeling, and comprehending. But it can also, and this is important, refer to created nature. What would created nature be in his default structure, which is that particular formation of the tree of life? Created nature is the fourth world. We talked about the four worlds in the last video. The world of Asiah, the world of action. It's only associated to the Sephirot Malkuth. Hold that thought. We're going to get back to that. Okay. We thus say the moon exists and is alive, and then we launch into looking at life as movement, the six directions. In the last video, I referred you to that wonderful essay by Dr. Jeffrey Kupperman looking at the sacred geometry of creation in the Sefer Yetzirah. We've talked about the same thing in the Timaeus. All right. So what we're going to get now is a kind of course of study almost by which one can understand that. He says the moon, existing and alive, is to be managed by the magisterial art of the elements, since it has the power to represent the fullness of the sun when its half circles are joined together by art. Okay. Now it is becoming explicit. You are the vessel being transformed through all these physical alchemy metaphors. You are what is being transformed. Your dross is being burned out, that type of thing. What? By the signs and symbols that you were contemplating in his symbolic creation and resurrection of the universe in the hieroglyphic monad. That's the path of the initiate. Now, in that hidden text of his, I mentioned Codex Marcianus graecus. That's also the only known source of the works of Zosimus of Panopolis. Zosimus describes something like this that's not Kabbalistic as the path of the initiate. That's something we're going to talk about very soon. But it's going to also be explicit in the very next theorem, 22. And by the way, the Latin word for vessel, vas, can also mean a tool or in a double sense. So the idea is that you are transforming yourself by letting these different transformational symbols, as Jung would call them, these different transformational symbols and these emanations of divine light, because that's what the Sephira are, after all, as you move up the middle pillar of the tree from Malkuth to Tiferet, or at least up the middle pillar of the tree in the world of created nature, or Asiah. Okay, so E is supposed to represent that process. So we were going to descend us back into earlier theorems to meditate upon things. So the way the earlier theorems would clarify that is we will see that same symbol of E right here, the way we projected Venus onto the tree of life at the end of Theorem 13, when we also projected Mercury and Mars onto the tree of life. These two of the three of these have persisted, as I said back when we were talking about Theorem 13, and your homework was to project these onto the tree of life. These snips that I'm putting on top of them now are from Israel Regardie's 1937 tome on the Golden Dawn, where he published basically the secret teachings of that order, or of the Stella Machatina, and scandalized everyone in 1937, but it's easy to find material now. So these two are still used, and they're part of the knowledge lectures that Regardie published. The middle one is not, as far as I know anyway, used now. That's largely because we don't use that symbol that D created for Mars there. We just use the usual one with the arrow pointed off at the top of a circle. The other thing is to project this one onto a tree. You've got to have his little Aries glyph in there, has the fire that is in effect sort of firing you up the tree, in this case from Malkuth to Yesod. But moving back to these things. So E is just like Venus projected onto the tree of life. Now what we're going to look at is what these being, living, feeling, and comprehending would be in Latin. Just so you know, there's not any sleight in my hand in this translation, although I don't know what I'd really be accomplishing with that sleight of hand. But anyway, in Latin, this is esse, vivere, sentire, intelligere. So there are many things in the hieroglyphic monad that were very difficult for Nancy and I to translate. This isn't one of them. It's a fairly easy translation. The only other way I think you could translate this would be like to be, to live, to feel, and to comprehend, or maybe instead of feel, you could say sense, or with comprehend, you could say think or cogitate. But it's a pretty easy translation. That's the good news. The bad news is in Latin, just like English, these words have a wide range of shades of meaning. And, well, but then the good news is those shades of meaning between Latin and English aren't that different. And they could be, but they're not. Let's go on to this next thing here. The moon exists and is alive. We've already talked about this in terms of physical alchemy metaphors. So that if we make this luna viva or the living moon, that's a common the idea in physical alchemy that I go by is anything is going to mean at least three different things. So living moon can mean the same as living silver, argentum viva. Now, why would living moon be the same as living silver? Oh, you think that maybe the physical alchemist knew something about Cabala? They both correspond to Yesod. That's why living moon, living silver. And then you can equate that with, as a synonym to Quicksilver. Quicksilver has an easy equation with the philosophic Mercury. You can also do some things with double Mercury, Mercurius duplicatus. That will work even better if you're using Mercury on the Tree of Life. You can take all of that and study the Rosarium Philosophorum, which comes before D if you want, but you can certainly apply it even better to the chemical wedding of Kristen Rosenkreuz, which comes after D. And then it becomes a matter not only of the symbol you're using and what it's called, but why is it called that? What else can it correspond to? And what can it transform into? That's the habit of mind that you have been developing all the way through these transformations in the hieroglyphic monad. All right, let's look at what his Latin for grade is. That's another easy translation. It's gradum. And the degrees of meaning there, all puns intended, are the same, or the grades of meaning. It's a step, a stage, a degree, a grade. You can get 1 degree out of 360 degrees in a circle, but much more often it's a course of study, a grade in a course of study, a grade in a school. One example that Dee would easily know is Aristotle's Peripatetic school, which had grades. And peripatetic, by the way, is itself just a transliteration of the ancient Greek word that means walking or given to walking about, or peregrinating, a peregrination. So in that school, not like Plato's Academy, one would suspect, except this is Aristotle's Academy, you are thinking thoughts, great philosophical thoughts, while you're walking around. Today, we might say you're doing that to just kind of process it in your body or ground it in your body to as you work through very complicated ideas. Anyway, grades can, the way we're using it here is like grades in a course of study, grades in a school. So it appears we have 2 grades of the moon and we have 4 grades that are part of one of those grades. So what might those be? The easiest way to go about this is to consider the many, many groups he has of 4 and 2, and then look for a connection between the words and concepts. Before we do that, I was going to say, catch that last look at Venus on the Tree of Life and how it equates with E, right? Because you're going to want to think about that and remember that when this is Venus projected onto the Tree of Life, these can be the 4 lower separate. And this circle up here is the 6 upper sephira. That also solves a particular numbering problem that you have with this diagram, B, D, C, and E. I mean, first, one problem we talked about is there's no A. We solve that by, well, if A was the Edenic world, that is gone. So if that is gone, now we're looking at the world after it's fallen, like we had in 20 when it is resurrected and then ended. All right, so problem in terms of numbering here is E is the 5th number in the Roman alphabet. if we made this 5, and actually in the Greek alphabet, that would just be a capital epsilon, which looks like a Roman E. If we just make this Tifereth, that makes no sense because Tifereth is the 6th Sephira, but if we know that this is corresponding to the whole part of the tree, it makes more sense. All right, moving on. Let's look at some of his groups of 4, okay? So there's 4 elements that are associated with the cross of the element. Then that middle part is displaced. In 20, it merges with the one up at Tifereth. That's also, we don't have a dot here because that's the stone the builder rejected that symbolically is moved back up. We talked last time about the 4 worlds of Cabala, and I just mentioned how the 4th world of Asiah, or world of action, would connect to created nature. There is the 4 Sephiroth on the tree below Tifereth, which is what he suggests. And again, that displaced center of the cross of the elements is now in Tifereth. So it's gone from down here up. But you may be suspecting by now, this is Tifereth in the world of Asiah. And certainly it is, because that is the one way that his correspondences work. So for things to the reference to the 4 lower Sephiroth and the 4 elements to work, you have to have this be the Tifereth of Asiah that your initiatory path is aspiring to, at least in one of these grades of the moon. Why is that? Well, these 4 elements are only going to exist in the world of Asiah. When we talked about the Sephira Yetzirah in the last video, we saw how that 3 of the elements, air, water, fire, are up higher up in the tree, but there's no earth there. You don't get earth until Malkuth. And in fact, Malkuth of Malkuth, that is Malkuth in the world of Asiah, would be the absolute absence of life. Just wandering around in the world in total darkness, bumping into things, not knowing where you are or what's going on. Okay, let's look at groups of 2. Well, he's doing all this doubling stuff, so this must be real important to him. He's going to do that even more in the next one. But we've had lots of implicit groups of 2. His all of his references to the Hermetic tablet, as above, so below, or as within, so without, is another, interior and exterior. In the Timaeus, being and becoming. In the first chapter of the Sefer Yetzirah, the Sephiroth as polarized opposites. Day and night. Now, why do I put those in there? Well, they're going to be important in the next theorem, where he's going to talk about a man for all hours. But also, think of how important it was to him to have time start at Aries of Aries, where day and night are balanced. 12 hours of day, 12 hours of night, and 12 as important in all kinds of ways through here. 12 tribes of Israel, 12 lots of different things. Also, 12 is divisible by 2, 3, 4, 6. So that's an important opposite. They also, 2s and 4s might remind us of the 2 most commonly known riddles of the Sphinx, but I'm going to get back to that in a bit here. Let's look again at E and Venus on the Tree of Life and see if we can make some sense of this. He's talking about E, and if these are 4 lower grades, referring to the 4 lowest Sephiroth, there ought to be some connection between esse, vivere, sentire, intelligere, or to be, to live, to feel, to think, and what one might encounter in those lower grades, as he calls them. If not, we'll look at something else like 4 elements, or he might be equating them to both. But having said that, it's also fair to say that it's getting harder and harder to understand these things without a teacher. And I want to digress on that for just a moment, if I may. So, already mentioned how C.H. Jostin in his 64 translation says that the meaning of the monad is lost. It's supposed to be addressed to a group of initiates and accompanied by an oral teaching. I agree about the oral teaching. I just don't agree that the meaning is lost. I think it's basically been preserved in fragments over the years, or else I wouldn't have been able to figure it out. I'm quite far from being a brilliant individual. So the reason you're starting to need teaching here, though, is because if you have to know, say, calculus to understand how to structure a course about calculus, then it'd seem by definition, maybe you don't need the course about calculus. And that's what he's starting to do here. So maybe up through 20, you had text around where if you really worked hard, you could teach yourself calculus and come up with the structure of the course. But then if you do that, you don't need the course. So this theorem, more than any other theorem, is directly implying that you need a teacher. And again, I'm sorry that I'm the best you got now. I think there were much better teachers at one time. But I do think that the teaching continued for quite a while after Dee's time. Think of Athanasius Kircher, whose famous work we could say appropriates, but it basically plagiarizes the hieroglyphic monad. It gives you the same drawings with the same labels even as in the hieroglyphic monad. Well, that was useful for me understanding it because that's what directed me to look at the Timaeus and other works to begin with. But it also suggests that that teaching with the hieroglyphic monad continued for at least 100 years afterwards. Now, parts of it may have preceded Dee, since you can apply a lot of this very well, as I've said before, to the Rosarium Philosophorum, but it applies even better to the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz, which comes out after Dee's time, not long after, Dee's still alive, but with the hieroglyphic monad symbol there. Similar with the works of Basil Valentine. We're going to find some things here that they're in the hieroglyphic monad, but no one has really understood what they were till the works of Basil Valentine. And the real example of this is the so-called Yates thesis by Francis Yates. That is the idea that the secret philosophy behind Rosicrucianism was the philosophy of the hieroglyphic monad. Now, she talked about that, it was either the 70s or the 80s. Since then, many people have argued against her. And since she's not alive anymore to defend herself, I guess I want to put in a few words on her behalf and say, how did those people who argued against her, how did they think they knew what they were talking about? They knew that they didn't understand the hieroglyphic monad. So if they knew that they didn't understand the philosophy of the thing that she thought was the hidden philosophy behind Rosicrucianism, how could they be so sure of that? I don't think they could have been. And I think that she was right. And in fact, it was. Also, I think that there are ways that other teachings of this have stayed alive in esoteric currents that didn't necessarily publish what they were doing. Anyway, let me go back and share my screen here. One thing we can be clear about now is we understand why Dee has been using all of these works of physical alchemy as metaphor when he wasn't successful as a physical alchemist, because it's because he's talking about Malkuth of Asiah, the world of created nature, the world of action, the manifest physical world. And as I said, Malkuth of Asiah is going to be the total absence of light. So let's start and look at these words. Esse, to be, the most complicated verb in the English language, to be or not to be. Whole works of philosophy written about it. Let's see. So when he is talking about being, one thing we can be 100% sure of is this being is not in any way like that world of being he was talking about, particularly in the first 10 theorems where everything is perfect. There's no need to transform everything or anything if everything is already perfect. There's very little need for consciousness, actually, or consciousness knowing itself if everything is perfect. So this is a different type of being. It's a type of being that limits itself. And that is one of the many meanings of the verb to be you can get in English or Latin. In Latin, it's something like if you say esse ab aliquo, or you're of a certain, like, rather than saying just I am, I would say I am cherry. That's a certain kind of limit. Or I am a person. That's a limit. A person who lives in Wisconsin. A person who lives in the early 21st century. All of those things put limits on just I am. And so the minute you have that, then it's a limit. So if we start working up from Malkuth with Asiah and trying to make that correspond to Malkuth of Malkuth, you're looking at a person totally bound by circumstance. Would that fit? Well, you can make it fit. It's not a perfect fit, but bound by circumstance, not even aware of the circumstances that limit that person, perhaps. How about the next one? To live. Well, vivere, just like living in English, can have a multiplicity of meanings, of course. And one of them is to have a little bit more of a choice, like that's really living, or you do something that really lights a fire under yourself. It can mean brisk, more animated than usual. It livens up your being, all puns intended. So this isn't really, it's not a shoe-in for Yesod of Asiah, but it's workable. Now the next two match perfectly, to feel and to think. If you make a correspondence between to feel and Netzach, or whether it's in the great tree or the tree of Asiah, fits just fine. If you consider it the bottom of that whole pillar, works fine. Hod, to think, correspondence works perfectly. Whether it's the great tree or Hod and Asiah, or Hod as the bottom of a particular pillar on the polarized tree. So two of those fit perfectly, two are kind of workable. We could make that into a metaphor if we wanted to, and since I want to, I would say, well, knowing the direction you're going and what things mean when all the lights are off is kind of difficult, but the more the light starts to dawn, the more you can figure out what the structures are around you. Anyway, what about the elements? Well, what we said in the last video about the Sefer Yetzirah, and there's just 3 elements higher up in the tree, and those correspond directly to the mother letters, although then they're supposed to be associated with the father letters, which we're not told what are, but there's only 3 of them. We're used to 4 elements. We don't get the 4th until we're in Malkuth. Well, you can make the elements correspond to the 4 worlds, and we've talked about that. But if you try to take all of this and make the rest of it work that way, you can try it on your own. It won't fit, I promise you. But what if, since Asiah is the earth, and all of these elements combine and make earth, we have what he's been talking about all along, elementatas. It's going to fit perfectly. So Malkuth of Asiah is going to be like earth of earth. Yesod of Asiah is air of earth. Hod of Asiah is water of earth. Netzach of Asiah would be fire of earth. In fact, it works rather perfectly, and it works actually in the order of those mother letters, which is even, I don't know, I think it's fascinating. Now, that's only one way of thinking about it, but if you're following what I'm saying here, if you are a part of a Kabbalistically based initiatory society, this may just correspond to your grade structure. Imperfectly, yes, the first 2 are not perfect fits. But that system, and here I'm thinking of those that have some origin in the Golden Dawn cipher manuscript, that doesn't go back before the 1880s. So if whomever wrote the Golden Dawn cipher manuscript, and there are many theories about that, but whatever person or persons did that, did they come up with the same thing on their own? They may have. Did they know the hieroglyphic monad? Well, they certainly must have, because the only known source of the signs of the adept that are later used, as we've talked about, is the Monas Hieroglyphica. And I've already mentioned this about Frances Yates and her saying that the symbol of the hieroglyphic monad implies the whole philosophy of Rosicrucianism. All right. Now, there's something else that Dee is doing here, and I want to just up front thank Darcy Coons for input about this, because this was something that I never really realized until he gave me some tips on it. Let's talk about the riddle of the Sphinx and these 2 orders of the moon. Now, back in Theorem 18, Dee gave us these really opaque kind of riddles that we finally solved. And when he's setting those riddles up, he says that, or he implies basically, he's solving a real mystery of creation, kind of like Oedipus, and not just telling a fable like Aesop. All right, he doesn't tell us the riddle of the Sphinx. He never uses the word, but guess who does? The person who plagiarizes the heck out of Dee's monad, Athanasius Athanasius Kircher, in his Oedipus Egypticus. Here's the frontispiece of that. And I talked about this some in Dee's sources of Cabala and the origins of the Kircher tree and all that. But these two women up here they have a list of things, but they can also be thought to correspond to, once you read Oedipus Egyptus, which I'm not sure that I recommend anyone do. But if you read it, you start to see, oh, they correspond to the two riddles, and Kircher, who seems content to tell you everything, single thing he knows, tells you the solution to those riddles, which is very helpful. So the first one, what speaks with one voice but has 4 feet in the morning, 2 at noon, and 3 at night? That's man who crawls as a baby, walks as a young man, and walks with a cane as an old man. Notice there's 4 there. What are the 2 sisters who give birth to each other? Those sisters are day and night. Those words are feminine words in Greek. So those are the 2 solutions to those riddles of the Sphinx. But there's supposed to be lots of riddles of the Sphinx. Some people have looked very hard for them and not had a lot of success finding them. But in works like, say, the great play by Sophocles, Oedipus the King, we know that Oedipus has solved the riddle of the Sphinx, but we don't know what the riddle is. That's usually something that you get somewhere else. What about other riddles of the Sphinx? Well, in the 1880s, Eliphas Levi, in his Transcendental Magic, proposed 4 words for the Magus inscribed upon 4 symbolical forms of the Sphinx. And those are to know, to will, to dare, and to keep silent. 4 things. Well, those 4 things won't correspond to the 4 words that we're looking at, but they could well correspond to that other grade of the moon, the adept grade of the moon, the magus grade of the moon, which we don't get anything more about at this time. So now, what was Levi's source of that? Since Levi is actually obviously a couple centuries after Dee, almost 3 centuries, no one knows what his source is for that. No one knows if he made it up out of whole cloth, although Levi is pretty darn good when it comes to understanding magical symbolism, perhaps the best of his era. So could his source have been the same as Dee's and correspond to that second grade of the moon, that higher grade? Maybe. I mean, stay tuned. We'll see if we find it. But thanks again to Darcy Coons for pointing that out. Okay, I want to just run this through with the 4 worlds of Cabala, since I introduced that last time, but I don't want to presume to think that everyone just is carrying that structure around in their head. Okay, we have 4 worlds. Remember, if we did it this way, these are each associated with an element, usually absolute fire, Bria, water, Yetzirah, air, Asiah, earth. Now, if we do it that way, notice going up, earth, air, water, fire, we're going up the same way in the 4 worlds that we were going up these 4 lower Sephiroth. That's kind of fascinating. If we're worried about the 5th element, as I said before, the 5th element, it's very clear in the Sefer Yetzirah, the 5th element is Kether, though sometimes Christian Kabbalists make it the Sheen in Yod He Sheen Vav He and put it in Tifreth. Although I will say, a lot of times when that's happening among the Christian Kabbalists in Dee's era, it's not clear that they're aware of 4 worlds. And it seems quite obvious that Dee is aware of that. All right. Every world has its own mini tree, as we talked about last time. And as we've mentioned several times, in the 4th world, Asiah is only related to Malkuth. And when you get to Malkuth of Malkuth, that is the total absence of light. And these references to physical alchemy now make sense. He's working in the 4th world, the world of Asiah. He's trying to charge the elements in Asiah, the planets, metals, all these terrestrial things, because they're in Asiah with more heavenly analogs. Okay. And so, yes, we realize these Tiferet is actually the Tiferet of the fourth world, the world of Asiah, the world while we're still alive, the world of action. Just to show you a kind of cool thing here, though, if you're interested in working your way up the tree, these trees overlap in certain ways. And one way of looking at it is to take Malkuth of Yetzirah as overlapping with Tiferet of Asiah. So then once you go through these four grades, so to speak, and you are to Tiferet, which is what you've been aspiring to, right? Tiferet of Asiah, you are in Malkuth of Yetzirah. You're in the realm of the Yetziratic. But knowing that you're in the world of Asiah is maybe more of an impetus to study the names in Hebrew, since this is a Hebraic structure, obviously, of the 10 houses of Asiah, the 10 spheres, the 10 Sephiroth of that lower tree. A few more things about Luna existence and the physical alchemy metaphor going on there. Again, you are physically alive. You're in the world of Asiah, but your soul or your spirit, your astral double, your etheric body, whatever you want to call it, is going up the middle pillar, starting in the world of Asiah, in total darkness, Malkuth of Malkuth. Now you can see associations with silver and gold as metaphor in another way that is really awesome. And of course, this is going to be missed to some degree by scholars, I say, speaking as a scholar. You know, college didn't teach me a whole lot about studying auras. If it did, probably my parents would have objected to that. That's something you often study in esoteric thought, right? Well, if you are able to see auras or develop that ability, one of the things you sometimes see with someone is a beautiful, beautiful gold light around them. Personally, that's what I associate with someone who is in a Tiferetic space. That's the kind of energy that I like to have in the Tiferetic space if we are working with these Enochian stuff, to use a technical term. Anyway, so what are you doing? Well, in the silver of Yesod, you're trying to turn it into the energetic gold of Tifereth of Asiah. All right, you're the vessel being transformed. You're being transformed by the signs and symbols that you are studying. That's a Yesodic activity. So you're not just existing, you're livening up. Okay, your moon is really alive. And you're beginning to imagine structures that are taught to you by other people. That's a Yesodic activity. You can also link this back if you want to the nature rejoices in nature from Theorem 15. You can do like my friend Vincent Bridges did when he considered 15 the tantric key to the whole thing. You can turn it into some Western analog of Kundalini yoga if you want, but certainly the things about merging energy bodies that you see in Isis the Prophetess to her son Horus are, while they are associated much more with Eastern paths of spiritual development, yoga, they work just fine here as well. That's one of the reasons why Dion Fortune called Cabala Yoga of the West, though a lot of people have disagreed with her. Anyway, the 2 grades of the moon, one of which has 4 grades, is one of those the grades of the adepts? Well, I think so. Can I prove it? Well, if I could, I probably shouldn't say it, but let's just be honest. No, I can't prove that. But that's what I think is going on here. This whole initiatory path is going up the tree in Asiah, and we can make the associations with the Sephiroth in Asiah. All right. So we're going to look at this one last time. And I am omitting a multitude of other correspondences you can make because once you have the basic outline structure, they're easily available online. You're imagining this structure. As I've said, it's a Yesodic activity, presumably one that enlivens you. So let's go down here to the tree of Asiah. There's Yesod of Asiah. See where my cursor is? So these other 3 Sephiroth are around Yesod. You can easily picture a circle down there. If Yesod is the center point, there you have one moon. Now, remember our Venus on the tree of light symbol. Remember that circle up top. All of these upper Sephiroth So that's the other moon. The top of that tree of Asiah is one way of looking at it. So is that upper circle the upper grade of the moon? I would say it is, and I would say it's beginning here in Malkuth Yetzirah, which is the same as Tifereth of Asiah, but as they say, your mileage may vary. You'd want to study this further. And we have bumped into, by the way, a discussion that can involve Mercury on the Tree of Life. So let's switch to Mercury. There's Mercury on the Tree of Life. And it's a discussion in modern Hermeticism about whether or not you can have grades above the non-separate dot right there. Some people would say that you can't. But if we're talking about the world of Messiah, we're down here, right? We're not all the way up at the top of the great tree. Anyway, that's beyond the scope of this whole discussion, but something else to think about. So last thing I want to do, give you an interpretation of these squiggly lines again that we end with. Yeah, we know it's the Aries symbol. We know we can put it together and get a moon. We know it is a lowercase omega. We can go on flip on its side like that. It can be a lowercase epsilon. But this is also an 8, right? And it can be a 3 flipped 2 ways. So you can meditate upon that and come up with other correspondences also. And one would be the 2 grades of the moon. If that's what you're looking at here, and you're looking at how they are feeding back and forth right there. After Theorem 22, you can come back and look at this as an hourglass, just to toss that out there for anyone interested. Beyond this, there are all kinds of things you can do that are way beyond the scope of this video. All the things we've talked about, you can read through the Rosarium Philosophorum and you can apply it there. In fact, if you want to just get a whiff of that without taking a deep dive, just go to the translation, and I'll drop that link below too, that is on Adam McLean's alchemy site, levity.com. And word search through for Argentum Vivae and let that be Luna Vivae, the living moon. And I think you'll get a glimmer of what's going on. Now, to truly understand it takes a lot more study. But if you study the Rosarium Philosophorum as being about spiritual alchemy, like the Hieroglyphic Monad, rather than about physical alchemy, it'll make a lot more sense. That's why Carl Jung was so interested in it, and its kings and queens, and its active, passive, and all the kind of things that happen there, and the child, all of that, because he was looking at transformational symbols. Jung also discusses Mercurius duplicatus in the Rosarium Philosophorum. But like I said, that's all way beyond the scope of just one little YouTube video. I do want to mention again about the forming of letters. He talks about that here. I was going to have that discussion here, but this has gotten to be a very long video, so I'm going to roll in a discussion just of this symbol into one looking at this and the opening symbol in Theorem 22. All right. You can also relate particular keywords that you see in this theorem and others to attributes or qualities you find in the Sefer Yetzirah, like take grace as explored in the Sefer Yetzirah. Now, if you do that, we're pretty PG rated, but if you want to get racier than that, you can look at his repetition of the word member, understanding that the way that Isis remembered her husband Horus was a literal phallic reference. It was impregnating herself with his phallus, and then he's reborn as her son. So D in this theorem repeats the word members over and over. We have members of the ternary, a magnetic power enlivening these members, remembering with grace, or having restored our monad to its previous mystical site by artfully connecting its individual members. He is remembering things metaphorically the way that Isis remembered Osiris. Now, does D know the whole Isis Osiris story? Of course he does. There was a very controversial and scandalous Renaissance Pope even before Dee's time. This was the uh, Borgia Pope, who had drawings of his whole family. Yes, he was a Pope and who had children. Lots of the Renaissance Popes did. He had them portrayed as if they were participants in the rites of Isis and Osiris. So yes, who Isis and Osiris and Horus were was well known in the Renaissance. What wasn't known were things like how to read hieroglyphs, as we talked about briefly when we were touching upon the hilarious hieroglyphics before Apollo. Anyway, we're to the end of Theorem 21. We'll start in a few days with Theorem 22. Between then and now, I want to do a video on the alchemy in Zosimus of Panopolis to show you that in that type of Greco-Egyptian alchemy, and in fact, pretty much in any Greco-Egyptian alchemy, we're not talking about literally turning lead into gold. We're talking about physical alchemy. But that's enough for today. Have a great night. Bye-bye.